morning, everyone, and welcome to Rising with Elizabeth. Really, what motivated me to do this class is that people have been sending me questions about sourdough, and it reminded me I've done a number of in-home bread baking classes. In almost every class, without exception, people have a really hard time sort of wrapping their minds around how to care for and feed sourdough starter. So I really want to encourage you to be able to bake really great sourdough bread at home. And in order to do that, you need to know about how to work the sourdough. So that's why I'm offering this class today. And I just wanted to let you know that we are actually a huge group, like, I don't know, 150 people or something. So we want to encourage you to ask any questions through the chat function. So at any point during this class, you can ask questions, and we'll save time at the end to answer them. So I also want to say that I am not a professional bread baker, but I have been baking bread and working in wheat for the last 10 years, and I bake bread every week. And what I'm really excited to offer you is that I've taken a lot of bread baking classes from very well-known bakers. And in each one of these classes, it's been a professional setting, but I've really taken these nuggets from each one of these classes and been able to incorporate those into my baking. So over the years, my bread has gotten better and better. And so I'm really excited to share that with you today. Let's see. So sourdough is made up of two main ingredients, right? Flour and water. And flour being a major contributor to it, I wanted just to share, before we go into the sourdough demonstration, I wanted to share a little bit about the flour so that you can make better choices as a consumer and as a baker and choosing the right flour for yourself. So the first thing I want to say about flour is making the comparison with wine. So when I was growing up, my parents drank 3 different kinds of wine: red, white, and rosé. And then a few, I don't know, a decade or two later, all of a sudden there was this explosion of different varieties of wine and that were made commercially available. And now we know many of the names of the varieties of wine, where when I was growing up, I don't think my parents knew what a Chardonnay or a Pinot Grigio was. So the same thing is true with wheat, except we haven't had that explosion yet of the different varieties. There are over 140,000 varieties of wheat, and most of those are living in seed banks. And really just dormant, waiting to bring flavor and different flavor profiles, different nutrition, and also different farming characteristics. So Honoré is interested in this process of bringing back these old varieties of wheat. So I wanted to tell you about just one of them. It's called Harani, and it's from the Masada Fortress, and it was founded in the year 73 AD, and it was buried until the 1940s when it was excavated. And the same man that found the Dead Sea Scrolls found this Harani wheat, and it traveled to a seed bank and then to Washington State University's bread lab. And the bread lab has taken an interest in what Honoré Farm and Mill is doing and trying to recover and bring back these old heirloom grains. So they sent us, last year, they sent us a half a baggie full of these Harani grains, and we planted those up in the Russian River Valley on the farm that's been donated to us for this purpose. And at the end of that season, we harvested 5 pounds of Harani, which was so exciting. So just a month ago, we put the Harani back into the ground, and I'm really hoping for a big harvest because I actually have not tasted this grain yet. And I'm really excited to be able to mill some and bake some bread. So these are the kinds of activities that Honoré is really interested in, and also educating you about all these different varieties that just cannot hit the commercial market yet. But your purchasing our flours helps support the farmers that will grow these grains, and we're more likely to have more varieties the more people are baking and using these flours. So that's a little bit about varieties. I also have the 2 varieties next to me that I bake with almost all the time. One is Red Fife, one is Sonora. Sonora is the oldest North American grain, because wheat is not native to North America. And the Red Fife is a red winter wheat, and it's a great bread baking flour. And the Sonora is a soft spring wheat, which means it's more of a pastry flour. But I love the sweetness of the Sonora, and I love the baking qualities of the Red Fife. So my recipe for sourdough bread is made up of a 50-50 blend. And also the flour that we will be feeding our sourdough starter. And if you receive some dry starter from us, it is also a 50-50 Sonora and Red Fife blend. I'm going to go to this close-up camera for those of you who haven't seen these flours before. And I want you to see the difference. Hopefully you can appreciate. This is the Red Fife, which is much darker. And here is the Sonora, which is much lighter. So a little too close. Okay, how's that? There we go. Got darker Red Fife, and there's the Sonora. Okay, so also in sort of helping you appreciate flour, we get flour by milling grains of wheat. And I brought a sheaf of wheat that we harvested last summer. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our harvest party. If you're interested in expanding your bread baking journey, I hope you'll come and join us in August. God willing, we'll be able to have the harvest party. And it's just a great opportunity to come up to a beautiful, beautiful place and a farm and put your feet on the earth and get a hand sickle and be able to harvest these grains. It's a really extraordinary and unique experience. And we go through the whole process of harvesting and threshing and winnowing, and it's just a great morning of a large group all working together. And then afterwards we sit down at a wonderful farm lunch at a long table, and we share local wines and local foods, and of course bread baked from last year's harvest, as well as our shortbread cookies. So stay tuned for information about that harvest. Okay, so I wanted to just also help you understand some of the nutritional differences in flours, and primarily the nutritional difference between white flour and whole wheat flour. So I'm going to show a slide right now, which is a figure of wheat. And what you'll see is you'll see a kernel of wheat. It's going to take a minute to get there. So you see there's a kernel of wheat here on the left side, and then there's the composition by weight on the right side. And what you'll see, and this is a very simplistic figure of wheat. Wheat has three main components. They're important to know. The outside coat is called bran, and it's where all the fiber comes from. The germ is where most of the healthy fats and oils and B vitamins and nutrients come from. And then the largest part, as you see the light pale yellow, is the endosperm. So the endosperm is where the starch and the precursors to gluten are. And white flour is made only from the endosperm, and whole wheat flour is made from the whole grain. So I just want to turn your attention to the bottom chart, because I think it's really illustrative in terms of the nutritional differences. So when you're making choices about whether you're going to buy white flour or whole wheat flour, or what you want to serve your family, I want you to know about the different nutritional values. So you can see that the bran has a lot of healthy carbohydrates. There's protein, and mostly what it has, the bran, is it has that fiber, but it also has a ton of iron in it. Going to the bottom, you can look at the germ, and you can see it also has healthy carbohydrates, a lot of protein, and you can see a ton of the iron, and also all of those B vitamins and those omega-3 fatty acids. And what we know about the whole grain when it's taken together is that those B vitamins are actually very protective against Alzheimer's. We are suffering a nutritional loss in this country. You know, a lot of us go and buy supplements in the center aisle of our supermarket. And if we could go back to eating these beautiful whole grains and these whole foods, we actually would get a lot of these nutrients from our food. And so let's go back to the chart and look at the endosperm, which is the middle. And you can see the endosperm is really just primarily carbohydrate. So when the endosperm is actually cut off from the whole grain, it becomes white flour, and it's really just milled starch, and you can see how few nutrients it actually has. Okay, so now I'm going to just share with you very briefly a little bit about how you get white flour and how you get whole wheat flour. So white flour has always been sought after because it's so sweet, and throughout the centuries people wanted it because of that sweetness and because it's shelf stable. The minute you add the germ, it becomes a perishable product and can go rancid. So that's why you can have white flour on the back of your pantry for a long time and it's never going to go bad because it's basically inert. So there's a milling process that was developed about 100 years ago. It's very effective. You can produce a lot of white flour, which is what our commercial industry mostly produces. And it's called a roller mill, and it splits off the bran into one component, it splits off the germ into a second component, and it splits off the endosperm into a third component. And so mostly the germ and the bran are sent to use as animal feed, and the white flour is what goes into the majority of global diets, actually. So that's the roller milling process. And the roller mill can produce whole wheat flour, but the way it does it is it takes mostly endosperm and it adds back a little bit of the germ. Producers, huge corporations that, there's just a few corporations that actually sort of have ownership of our flour market. The way that they make the whole wheat flour is they try to not use any of the germ, because the minute you put germ into whole wheat flour, it becomes perishable, as I said again. So if you've got whole wheat flour on the back of your shelf and it's been there for a long time, chances are it doesn't have any germ in it. So basically it's a reconstituting of the grain to make this whole wheat flour. And sadly, according to the USDA and the FDA, whole grain flour only needs to be 51% whole grain to be considered whole grain. The other 49% of whole grain flour or whole wheat bread can be white flour or starch. So that's the first method. It's the roller mill that basically makes this white flour. The second method is a method that Honore uses, and it's a stone mill. And so with a stone mill, it's a very different process. At the top, you have a hopper, and the grain seeds go into the hopper. They pass through two enormous, very heavy stones, and it comes out, and it's pressed into and ground into beautiful, fresh flour that has all of the nutrients of the germ and the bran and the endosperm all together. And what's incredible is when you actually mill these together, there's something in the bran that protects and actually preserves the oil in the germ when they are milled together. That's not true when they're recombined later. So it's sort of this amazing, perfect package when it comes in a whole grain form. And the stone milling is also a lot like milling fresh coffee, where when you mill the beans, you can smell them, the aroma is the highest and the taste is the highest. The same thing is true with flour. The minute the flour is milled, it is at its peak of aroma and flavor, and also, really importantly, nutrition, because it oxidizes over time and loses its nutritional value. So the idea of us providing freshly milled stone milled flour means you're getting the best flavor, best performance, and the most nutritious flour that you can get. So that is a little background on some of the things I've learned about flour. Now I'd like to turn our attention to sourdough. So again, as I said, sourdough is really nothing but flour and water left to ferment. And as it ferments, a number of things happen in these reactions. On the outside of the grain are actually healthy bacteria, and those are released as the grain is mixed with water. And also there's wonderful yeast, sort of wild yeast, that are in our air, and those interact to make this fermenting substance that leavens our bread, it conditions our bread, it actually even pre-digest the gluten in the flour. The lactobacillus and the yeast together break it down and pre-digest it and make sourdough products much more digestible. So if you have any kind of gluten issues, and a number of the people in the honorary community do, it's really heartening to know that they can actually eat our flours or eat products baked with our flour. And I'm actually one of those people. I've had my own health issues and I don't eat any modern wheat. It really affects me. But I really love to have these products because I feel really good when I'm eating them. So sourdough is this beautiful culture, and it's much more rich and diverse than, let's say, powdered yeast. Powdered yeast is just one form of yeast. It's just one strain of yeast. So the sourdough has the bacterial component, and that does three primary things with sourdough. As I said, of course, it gives the flavor and it conditions it, but it also, when you're starting with our whole wheat flour and you're baking with sourdough, you're not only getting all the nutrients from the whole grain flour, you're actually getting more nutrients from the grain when you're using sourdough, because in whole grains, there is a substance called phytic acid, and the phytic acid acts as sort of a little lock around a number of the nutrients in the grain. So when you bake with whole grain, like ours or any whole grain, and you use yeast, you're not going to be able to unlock some of the nutrients. It's only when you bake with sourdough starter that the yeast and the bacteria break open that phytic acid and make all of the nutrients bioavailable to us. So the nutritional value of your products really increases when you use sourdough. It also makes it more digestible, as I said before, because it pre-digests the gluten for us. And over a long, slow fermentation, almost all of the gluten is removed from your bread products using a sourdough method. And then the last benefit of sourdough starter is that it's a natural preservative. As I mentioned, in the wheat itself, in the flour itself, the interaction of the bran and the germ together preserves the flour, but also the acids and the natural occurring alcohols in the sourdough starter act as a preservative. So if you think about bringing home beautiful, fresh, white baguette or some kind of bread, and you leave it, you don't finish it, and you leave it overnight on the counter in the morning, it's going to be pretty hard. But with bread baked with sourdough, it actually can last for a week out on the counter. So the preservative factors of sourdough are pretty incredible. And that's it, your bread lasts a week. So the last thing I wanted to say about sourdough starter is you're trying to form a relationship with your sourdough starter because it's such a critical ingredient to baking bread. And there's an old tradition among bakers that people actually name their starter. And here's some of my starter that I brought. And my starter is actually named Theo. And Theo is a female, and it's short for a Greek word called Theotokos, or the God bearer, Mary, the mother of God. And I just think of sourdough starter as being sort of this God bearer, this life giver. So think about what you want to name your starter. Okay, so now let's start the demonstration. And for the demonstration, two things were left off of the supply list for some of you, and we're going to need these fairly soon. And one is a small sieve, and the other is a spoon. So just wanted to mention that. And I also want to mention to those people who have taken my in-class, in-person sourdough bread baking class, I want to let you know that we're actually using a different method to feed our sourdough starter than I taught you earlier. And I'm really excited about this new method because you actually don't need to discard any of the starter throughout the feedings of the process in preparing to make bread. So I think that that is a really incredible little thing that I've gleaned from a very famous baker in our area. His name is Dave Miller, and I've worked with him, studied under him, as well as I'm in good company because Chad Robertson has also studied with Dave Miller. He's the owner and chef of Tartine Bakery in San Francisco. And for those of you who have heard about the author Michael Pollan talks about visiting Dave Miller in his bakery in this book called Cooked. And there is a wonderful chapter in this book on wheat and bread. It's entitled Air. And if you're interested in knowing more about wheat and bread, I highly commend this to you. So we're going to begin with the end in mind in terms of making our sourdough starter. So in order to feed our dough, the starter, we're going to do 3 separate feedings. And each of these feedings, we're going to add fresh flour and fresh water at these 3 different intervals. And within these different feedings, there's going to be 8 to 12 hours apart between each of these intervals. So if we feed it this morning, and we feed it tonight, and we feed it tomorrow morning, by tomorrow afternoon, you will be ready to bake. So I also want to say that we are going for approximations. We're going to be doing some weighing with our digital scale, and we're going to, at the end result, we're going to try to create 150 grams of sourdough starter. And I'm going to say that's an approximate, because really what we're doing is we're creating one substance at the end that's going to be used for 2 different parts. One, the larger part of it is going to be going into our bread dough, and a very small part of it we're going to save for the next time that we bake. So I go for 150 grams to make 1 loaf of bread according to the Honore recipe, because you won't have very much left over, and therefore you're not going to waste any or feel like you have to bake with your sourdough starter when you're just getting as a beginner with sourdough. So these are approximations. I want to say that that's different when you're weighing your ingredients to bake bread. So when you're weighing your ingredients to actually mix the dough and bake the bread, these weights do need to be very exact and precise, because a bread, to make bread, actually the professionals don't call it a bread recipe, they call it a formula. So that is very exact, but what we're doing here is really approximations. So I also wanted to say, I find it really helpful to have a notebook and a pen when I'm feeding my starter, and also when I'm baking bread. This is something many professional bakers do, because at the end of feeding your starter and then baking bread, if it is a flop, you are going to have all this data to be able to go back and see what it was that you did and try to do something different the next time. On the other hand, if your bread is fantastic, you are going to want to look at what you did and you're going to want to recreate that. So the more you can act like a scientist and record certain data, the faster you'll learn. Okay, so the first step that we're going to take is we're going to revive the dried starter that many of you ordered from us. If you have a wet starter at home, we'll go through that step next, but we need to revive this first to be able to catch up with you and your wet starter. So let's revive the powdered sourdough starter. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to take a fairly wide bowl, and we're going to go to the close-up image here. And you're going to place your small sieve on the bowl. And then I'm going to open the package of sourdough starter. And I'm going to put that into the sieve. Now what we're going to do is we're going to tap gently on the side of the sieve. And this is going to release the flour that was attached to these sourdough bits. So you can see these are kind of, it looks a little bit like breadcrumbs almost. So those are the sourdough bits, and here is the flour. So we have 2 components, the sourdough bits and the flour. So we're going to take the sourdough bits, and using our digital scale, we're going to turn that on, and your scale should be marked to grams. And we are going to put a glass bowl on the scale, and then we're going to zero it out or tare it. by pushing that button, and therefore now we'll know only the weight of what is contained in the bowl and not the weight of the bowl itself. And what we're going to do is we're going to take these sourdough bits and we are going to put those into the glass bowl. And I see that I have 5 grams of sourdough bits, and you might want to record that when you're doing this at home. And to these sourdough bits, what we're going to do is we're going to add just a very small amount of water, maybe 10 grams I'm going to try to go for. Let's see. No, I got about 16 grams, a little bit more. So what we're going for is sort of a mush, and I'm just going to use my finger and just kind of stir that around. And ideally, this water is a little warmer than room temperature, maybe 80 to 85 degrees. So if you touch your finger to it, it won't feel super warm because, of course, our body temperature is a lot warmer than that. So 80 to 85 degrees. So we're now softening those sourdough bits, and that's going to take an hour. So I'm going to set that aside. And for demonstration purposes, I have some fed sourdough bits here where the flour has not been added back. So the second step in reviving those the dried starter is to add back the flour that we sifted off. So I'm going to add that back, and using a little spoon here, I'm going to mix that up. And it looks like it actually might need a little bit more water. I'm going to add a little more water to that. So getting the right consistency is something that you'll just have to practice with and observe. And as you're taking notes, you want to make notes about that. It's a little bit like a thick hummus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set that aside now. That is our first feeding for the dried starter. I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to show you how to feed your sourdough starter from the wet form. So again, I'm going to put another bowl on the scale, and I'm going to tear that out. And I have some wet starter here, and I'm going to just take out just a tiny bit. Really don't need a lot. I think maybe, let's see, 2 grams. That should be plenty. You really don't need a lot. If you think about feeding your sourdough starter, you can think about people. The bigger the person, the more, typically the more they eat. So the more sourdough you have, the more fresh flour and water you have to add. So we're always trying to work with very small amounts so that we don't have to discard any of the flour. So to this, I guess now it thinks it's 3 grams. That can sometimes change. I'm gonna add just maybe 5 grams of water. I'm just gonna moisten that. Sometimes letting this sit for a little bit so it can hydrate. It's easier, but you want to break up all of these bits in here. And to that, we're going to add just a small amount of flour. So let's see, 12, maybe to 12. And we're going to mix this up. That looks a little bit more liquidy. So you can see I'm working in really tiny amounts. You really don't need, starter is very, very powerful. You don't need a lot of it. Okay, I think that looks good. And so we're going to set aside our first fed. We have the one that we fed, that we revived from the dry starter, and we have the one with starting with the wet starter. And this constitutes our first of 3 feedings. So I'm going to set that aside. And I'm going to talk about, now we're going to let that rest for 8 to 12 hours. I'm going to say 12 hours. So it's, see, it's 9:30. So at 9:30 tonight, your sourdough starter, your sourdough starter should be ready to be fed for the second time. Now, where do you put your sourdough starter when it's resting for these 8 to 12 hours? Mostly what you want to do is you want to make sure that you pay attention to it. So the way that Theo gets my attention is that she lives in this cabinet behind me, and that's where I keep all of the tea mugs. And there is pretty much not a morning that goes by that I don't have a cup of tea. So I love it when I am making bread and the starter, she's up there, I open the cabinet and there's just this waft of like sweet kind of boozy aroma that comes down, and Theo is saying, hey, it's time for breakfast. So that always reminds me to be able to feed the starter. You can also keep your starter out on the counter. That's, you know, if that's a good place that you won't forget about it. If you do that, you might want to cut a small piece of cheesecloth and put that over the top of the starter, maybe secure it with a rubber band, and that'll keep out any unwanted debris. Now, when your sourdough starter is fed and it's active and you're working towards baking bread, you're not going to cover your starter. And that's a common mistake because if you cover it and deprive it of oxygen, it will die and it'll go anaerobic and eventually die. So you want to keep it uncovered at this stage. Okay, so that was our first feeding. Let's go to our second feeding now. I have some sourdough starter that I fed last night. I rehydrated the powdered starter, and it was about 12 hours ago, and I wanted to show you the difference of this starter. So we're going to go up close again. So here is the one that I just fed. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. And it basically looks like flour and water. And if I smell it, it just smells like flour and water. I don't smell any fermentation. In this one, you can see it's a little bit dry on top, so it might have needed a little bit more water. I don't see any bubbles there, but if you look on the side, there are bubbles forming here all along. Can you see those?
Yes.
All along there? Okay, so that means the fermentation process has begun, and we're ready to give this starter, which has been resting for 12 hours, its second feeding. So I'm going to tear my scale, and I'm going to put the starter on the scale. Actually, I'm going to tear that out. I have another identical dish. And I'm going to take the weight of the dish away by tearing it, zeroing it out. And I'm going to put the sourdough starter that's been fed once on the scale. And we see that that weighs 15 grams. And what we're going for is more or less 50 grams on this next feeding. So I'm going to add water to that. I'm going to try to start with about 20 grams of water. So it's going to go to 35. There we go. Okay, and now you can see definitely had a little bit of a sort of a hard coating on the top of it. And this is because I didn't add enough water to it last night. So if you get a hard crust on top of your starter between the feedings, you might want to consider making a note and then just adding a few more grams of water to that. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to break up all the bits of the sourdough in the water. And it's a good idea to always add the water first and the flour second. It's just a lot easier to mix up that way. So now we're going for about 50 grams. So I'm going to add some flour to this, some fresh flour to give it some food. So the sugars in the endosperm are actually what are feeding the lactobacillus and the yeast in the starter. And so the enzymatic activity that we're seeing is the predigestion of all those sugars and proteins, and then the release of carbon dioxide gas. And that's what those bubbles are. So we're going to add a little bit more flour here. I might just stop there and see how we're doing. Let's see. So you can see in this one, I don't know if you can see those bubbles. So even after just one feeding, this is our second feeding, you can see how active and happy Theo is here. So, and I do see some lumps in here, so I'm going to want to try to get rid of those lumps, really mix it up well. And I think I'm going to add just a tiny bit more flour. Just a little bit thicker. That looks good. So that is our second feeding, and it weighs 45 grams, which is really just perfect. So again, so that's our second feeding. Again, that is going to sit and wait for about 8 to 12 hours. And the difference between 8 to 12 hours when it's resting in between feedings really depends on the temperature of the day. So if it's a warm day, your fermentation process is going to go a lot faster. And if it's a cooler day, it's going to slow down. So that's why when we are storing our sourdough starter, we put it in the fridge, because that really slows down any kind of fermentation that's happening. So you'll notice, and this will show up in the journal that you're going to keep, in the summer, it happens a lot faster, the fermentation process, than on a day like today, where it's fairly cool in Northern California. So that is our second feeding. And we have about 45 grams. So now we're ready for our third feeding. And this third feeding, there's an important transition that happens, because you notice that I've been using the word sourdough starter. So on the first feeding, it's sourdough starter, and on the second feeding, it's sourdough starter. And on the third feeding, we call it a different name. We call it levain. And levain is really just the French word, which is the last feeding before mixing. So your sourdough starter, first feeding, sourdough starter, second feeding, and then you feed it and it becomes the levain. And again, that's one substance that's going to have the majority of it going into your bread dough, and a very small amount that we're going to save for the next time that we bake. So because we're aiming for about 150 grams to make one loaf of bread, I'm going to use a bigger jar. I'm going to use this measuring cup, and I'm going to do an up-close vision image again here on the scale. So I'm going to zero that out. I'm going to put the measuring cup on the scale. Again, I'm going to zero it out again. And I have some sourdough starter that has been fed twice here. Let's see if you can see that actually. So this one has a lot of really nice bubbles going on. And I am going to put that in first. So we're going to see how much sourdough starter we have. And yeah, the smell of that is just incredible. It's just got this really sweet and kind of sour aroma. I'm going to try to get all of that out and put this into what is going to become our levain. One thing I want to just mention here, as a brief aside, is can you see how little sourdough starter is left in this bowl? If for some reason something happens to your starter, you could actually add fresh flour and water to just this tiny bit of amount of sourdough, and you would have new starter. It's just an incredibly powerful substance. So I just wanted to point that out. So let's return this to the scale, and we see that we've got about 37 grams of sourdough starter, to which we're going to add flour and water. And we want it again to approximate 150 grams. So I'm going to put in maybe, get this to about maybe 85 or so. And let's mix that up. And there's some little chunks, and you're going to want to, this will be easier too over time. If you pour in the water and just wait a minute, the sourdough will break up and soften. Okay, so that was the water, and next I'm going to add some flour. Let's see, we're going to get to about 120. Let's see what happens. The ratio is essentially more flour to water, so it's not a 50-50 ratio. Maybe it's a 60-40 ratio. So I didn't add all the way to 150 grams yet because I want to be able to adjust it with more flour and water and get it so that it's at the consistency that I want. So again, I'm breaking up any sort of flour particles. Yeah, so we're only at about, there's some sourdough starter on my spoon here, but we're going to need to make a little more. So go add that, stir that in. Now I'm going to add some more flour. Let's see. Even though this one has just added fresh flour and water, it's not nearly as, it smells a little bit fermented. And I'm actually seeing, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, but I'm actually seeing little fermentation bubbles, even though we've just fed it quite a lot of flour and water. So let's see if I put that in there. Okay. We are darn close to 150 grams. Let's see. Well, we're almost at 150 grams. And as I said, an approximation is really what we're going for. So what you have here, and we'll go back to the bigger screen here, is we have this one substance that has now become levain. And in 12 hours, so we did our first feeding this morning, second feeding tonight at 9:30. Let's say the third feeding would be tomorrow morning, Sunday morning. You would be ready to bake this after it's rested for 12 hours. You'd be ready to pick up and bake your sourdough loaf. And I just want to point out on the Honore recipe that we have on our website, which is really simple and step-by-step, if you see, it says step 1 is make the levain 12 hours ahead, which we have just done. And then you're going to be mixing the dough, and you're going to be mixing 120 grams of this levain into your bread dough, and the rest of it you can save for the next time that you bake. So that is essentially how you feed your starter. So I'm just going to review that again. So we start with either wet or dried sourdough starter, to which we add fresh flour and water, and that is your first feeding. We wait 12 hours. And then we feed that, approximately getting to approximately 50 grams fresh flour and water. And we let that sit for 12 hours, and that was your second feeding. And then the third time, we're aiming for about 150 grams of sourdough starter once it's been fed with fresh flour and water, and that becomes your levain. So the last thing I'd really like to share with you is how you store your sourdough starter. And because we're working with both the dried and the wet, I'm going to show you how to store your sourdough starter. Both will be in the refrigerator. And let's start with the powdered sourdough starter. So we're going to go back to the small screen again and up close. And I'm going to take the levain, and we're going to pretend that this has been, actually, I have some that is actually, I'm going to take this one. Can you see? Look at the difference between, this is one that was just fed, and this is, of course, this one's been mixed a little bit, didn't wipe down the sides, but can you see all those beautiful carbon dioxide bubbles that are being released, and all along the side, there's just tons and tons of bubbles. So this levain is really raring and ready to go, and what we would call ripe and ready. So I'm actually going to take my wider bowl again, and I'm going to zero it out. And I'm going to take just a little bit, maybe like 5 grams of the levain. And I'm going to put that in this bowl. Go. That's 5 grams. That's a little bit more. 6. I want 5. So really, again, you don't need to. The more sourdough you have, the more you have to feed it flour, and the more you'll have left over. There we go. Okay, so to dry your sourdough starter, to store it in the refrigerator, you're going to take 5 grams of starter, and then you're going to add 3 times the weight of the starter in flour. So that would be 15 grams of flour. So I'm going to add 15 grams of flour. I don't know if you can see the weight here. Okay. So I'm going to try to get to 20. There we go. Okay. So the next step is you're just going to use your hands, and it just takes a minute. And you're just going to work in the flour into the sourdough starter until it resembles breadcrumbs, sort of where we began with this whole process to begin with. So just kind of work it in fingers. There's going to be the sourdough bits, and then the flour, and there you go. So that's really what you're going for. And it has a really nice aroma. Even though you just added a lot of flour to it, I can really still smell the levain. Now to this dried starter, I'm going to put that in a jar, in a small mason jar like this, with a tight fitting lid. And I'm going to put that in my refrigerator. And a really important thing to do is once you put your starter in here and you close the lid, you're going to want to label it, because it kind of looks a little funky in your refrigerator. And if anyone else in your house might see it, they might not know what it is and they might throw it away. So you always want to label your starter when it's in the fridge. Okay, so the second way that we're going to store starter, you can do it either way, is using it, beginning with a wet starter and keeping it wet. So again, I'm going to tear that. I'm going to again add just about 5 grams. Okay. And then to this, I'm going to add enough flour to make a pretty thick paste. Not quite the crumbles, but that might have been a little bit too much flour, so I'm going to add a little bit of water to that. But essentially, you've got your ripe levain, and before you put it into the fridge to slow down the fermentation process, what you're doing with the flour is you're giving it a nice feeding. So essentially, it's going to look like that after you've fed the wet starter. And again, we're going to put a lid on it. You're going to label it, and you might even want to date it, and you're going to put that in the fridge. So again, we're going to come to the large screen here. And in terms of baking with sourdough starter, when it's in your refrigerator, depending on how often you want to bake, I think most bakers feed their starter about once a week. So they'll take their starter out and they'll add just a little bit of fresh water and flour and kind of give it a little nutrient and then put it back into the fridge. This will keep it really ready to go, and you'll be able to do the 3 feedings and bake your bread, a day and a half later. Sometimes I have left my sourdough starter in the fridge for a lot longer and without feeding it. And it's actually not a problem. So if you go on vacation for a couple of months when we can, again, leave our homes, it's really no problem. Show you, here's some starter. It's looking a little nasty on the sides. There is a brown liquid on the top, and that is formed because it is basically the carbon dioxide releasing and turning into alcohols with a combination of reaction with the enzymes and the lactobacillus and yeast. So That brown liquid looks really nasty, but it's actually harmless, and you just pour it off. It's called booch, kind of like the bootlegger's alcohol name. And you just pour it off and you scrape out some sourdough, and then you start the process. If you are beginning with sourdough that hasn't been fed for a number of months, sometimes you'll need to, in my experience, it takes more than 3 feedings to get it going again. But essentially, that is the process. You can, once it's in the refrigerator, it's pretty safe. And I've literally had some sourdough starter in my fridge for years and have not fed it. It looks pretty nasty, but every single time I've taken it out, I've been able to bake again with it. So this is the ending of the demonstration portion of the class. I'd now like to answer some questions from all of you. And I'm going to start with the questions that I received last night. And then I have some other questions here. So here's some questions that people sent in ahead of time, and thanks for doing that. One is, can we bake bread without an electric stand mixer? Absolutely. Look at the recipe. You'll see that with a bread hook, you're just mixing for about 3 minutes. These flours are so alive. Once you add the water and the levain to it, I mean, it just pops to life. So it doesn't need a lot of mixing. So you can absolutely do that by hand. So you don't need to have a stand mixer to make great sourdough bread. In fact, I think for most of human civilization, people have not had stand mixers. So what can you use unused starter for? So as I mentioned, some of the things that we're doing here during the shelter at home is we're developing some sourdough bread, sourdough recipes like banana bread and naan and pizza dough, but there is also pancakes. And I swear you eat these pancakes in the morning and you are full until like 2 in the afternoon. So there's a lot of different uses, and sourdough is just a healthy ingredient. You can even add it to cookies after you've creamed your butter and sugar. You can add a little bit of sourdough starter, and it just gives a new and sort of more complex flavor to even cookies or other baked goods. So that's some of the uses of sourdough starter. Let's see. What do I do with my starter if I go out of town? As I said, I think you can really give it a nice, good feeding if you know you're leaving of flour and water, and then put it in the fridge, and it should be just fine when you get back. Okay, I'm going to look at some of the other questions here that people have asked. How do you spell Hourani? It's Hournai. Hournai.
A-N-I. A-N-I.
A-N-I. I spelled it wrong. Hourani. Okay, fortunately I have my crew to help me. Does King Arthur whole wheat have germ? I don't know. I really don't know the process of King Arthur. Should I be using filtered water? I think so. I think it's a good idea. I mean, there's a lot of things in our water with our modern filtration systems that we may not want in our bread. So yes, I do use filtered water. Let's see. When rehydrating the dried starter, does it need to be in the light for that? Does it need to be in the light for that 1 hour? No, it doesn't. You could put it away. You could put it in your cabinet. You might forget about it, however. I always set a timer for the hour, so I come back and then I add back that flour that we sifted back. Is it okay to use waxed cloth to cover it? I would think so, as long as it's not airtight. Do you always use the same types of flour? I do. I always use that 50-50 blend, and I think I mentioned that I just keep a jar like this in the same cabinet, so it's easy to feed it in the morning and the evening. Apparently sourdough starters do like to sort of have the same flour, and you can have multiple starters, and there's many different flours you can feed your sourdough. Rye is a very popular one. It's just not one that I've done. Let's see. Do you recommend a glass container for the starter, or can I use metal, clay, etc.? The reason why I recommend glass, again, is because you can see all of the bubbles. And one of the things that baking bread offers us is sort of this recovery of our senses. You can smell the sourdough starter and where it is in the maturation process. You can see these bubbles, and you can taste the difference. So I think having a glass is actually the best thing, so you can really visualize, is there not just fermentation happening at the top? Can you see it around the sides? Because sometimes you can't see it at the top when it's just getting started. Okay, the ratio of water to flour or flour to water. Oh, I missed that note. Okay, so you're always going to add more water than flour. And I think it's about a 60-40 ratio. I really do it by feel. And also, again, temperature matters, because the warmer it is, the faster the water evaporates. Okay. Do we need to keep track of the amount of water that we add to the levain so that we know what the hydration in the levain part of that is? If you want to get that detailed, absolutely, you can do that. I typically, in baking, when you're doing a hydration level of bread, the higher hydration breads are something that are desirable, they're harder to bake. It's usually a ratio of the flour to the water, and it does not include levain. Are your starter recipe and instructions available on the website? You know, we are adapting them to this new method of using a dried starter and not having to discard any. So those will be up on the website in the next couple of days, and we'll also post a link to this class so you can review any parts that you didn't miss. So both of those things, yes, will be on the website. Let's see, do 2 feedings before making levain every time you bake, or do you feed it every day? Can you just make the levain before baking? Ideally, you're going to do it those 3 different times, all in sequence, morning, evening, morning. That really ensures that you're going to have the very best performance. Okay, we've just got a couple minutes here. How do I store my flour? I store the flour, the little bit that I go through pretty quickly when I'm feeding, I store in the cabinet, but I store my flour in the refrigerator in a plastic bag. I put a plastic bag around this bag, or if I'm gonna have it for longer, I put a plastic bag around it and I keep it in the freezer. See a couple of other questions. You can, this is the question is, do you not throw out any of your starter in the fridge before refreshing it with flour and water? You can, to reduce the amount of flour you're gonna add back. It depends on whether you wanna use that starter and bake with it and have it grow, or whether you wanna really keep it small. So it's really up to you. You can do it either way. So what is the consistency of the starter? As I said, it's like a thick, like a hummus feeling. You know, you can stir it, but if you pour it, it'll go really slowly. It's not going to just drip down. I hope that's a good enough explanation of that. Oh, how do you spell the French word for levain? It's L-E-V-A-I-N. What to do for the first step of the starter? I only had 1 gram of the chunky part of the starter. So that's fine. 1 gram of the chunky sourdough starter should be absolutely fine. You're just gonna add the water to it like we did, just a little bit. You're gonna mix it up with your finger, and then you're gonna let that soften for an hour, and then you're gonna add back the flour, and that will be your first feeding of the dried sourdough starter. Use the flour that you sifted when you first separated the bits out to feed the sourdough. And all of this flour, you fed it in the mix of the red Pfeiffer Sonora. I'm not sure I understand that question, but for the first feeding for the dried starter, you're just using the flour that you sifted off. For the second and third, you're adding fresh new flour from this jar, from some other source, and that's the Sonora and the red Pfeiffer. Okay, how do we achieve sweet sourdough still using the whole grain flour? Well, This flour is actually extraordinarily sweet. These old varieties, modern whole wheat flour actually has a very bitter bran shell because they want that to pop off in the roller mill. So the brands on these older varieties are actually really delicious and produce a very sweet bread. If you want to have a sweeter bread, you're going to feed your sourdough more often, and that will make it a sweeter sourdough. If you want to keep it in the refrigerator and feed it less often, that is going to make a more sour sourdough. And if you want to bake bread and have the end result be sweeter, you're going to ferment it for a shorter period of time. The longer the sourdough is fermenting in that bulk fermentation or in the proof form of baking bread, the longer the period of time, the more the lactobacillus consume the sugars in the flour, that endosperm that we talked about. So the longer the fermentation, the more sour your bread. So hopefully that answers the questions. I just want to thank you so much for your interest in working with heirloom grains, and I just wish you the very best in your bread baking. I hope you'll send us photographs that we can post. There's really just nothing that makes me happier when I hear sort of the joy and the pride of people that have studied with me, and they send me photographs and they're just so excited about their bread. So I hope you'll stay in touch. And we will be offering another class in 2 weeks on April 25th. And what I'll be doing is going through the Honore sourdough bread recipe step by step. So come and join us 9 o'clock, 9 to 10 next 2 weeks on April 25th. And hope you have a great day.